Mark Heim here, founder of Disaster Doc, sharing with you module number 13 of our series, Drought Disasters. So let's go through those learning objectives together again. After completing this lesson, we want the students to be able to define the term drought, to identify the natural and the human factors that contribute to the occurrence of droughts. We want to be able to list the factors that contribute to water shortages and to identify threats to health, to agriculture, and the environment from droughts. We also want to identify the locations of the 10 deadliest droughts for the past 50 years and to identify secondary disasters caused by droughts. We also want to be able to recognize those measures that increase the health impact of droughts, as well as recognizing those measures that actually lessen the health impact of drought disasters. So first off, our definition, we always start with that: a period of below average rainfall sufficiently long and intense to result in serious environmental and socio and economic stresses. In particular, we're worried about those health stresses, right? Those health impacts. And a drought usually takes months to years to develop, and we'll talk more about the importance of that observation. So there are factors that contribute to the occurrence of droughts, and we have natural factors and human factors. And these natural factors can be just random changes in the weather itself that either create short-term or long-term drought conditions, and also other factors that we'll talk about more in a minute, like El Nino's southern oscillation. Human factors that also contribute to the occurrence of droughts include deforestation, so practices that take away the forest from areas and therefore the ability for these areas to be able to hold water and be able to utilize that water in a way that sustains the vegetation and sustains also agriculture. Agricultural methods, if we tend to plow the ground, cause more erosion, have more baked soil as opposed to a soil that can hold that water, agricultural methods can also worsen these effects as well. Or actually, if we have appropriate and adaptive measures for agriculture, we can actually make that better. So human factors play into this to a great deal. In addition, our built environment, the way that we build things, our cities and our environment that we actually create ourselves as human beings, also either contribute to less droughts or more droughts. And finally, human factors of climate change. We put more carbon into the atmosphere that warms the entire global climate. This global warming has the effect of climate change and then creates these drought-like conditions around the world as well. And we're already seeing that in many areas around the world. So first off, this idea of El Nino southern oscillation, because some people hear El Nino years from time to time, or La Nina years, and what this really means is this is actually a change that occurs every 5 to 8 years. It's variable according from each season to season, and usually it changes the Pacific currents. And so this is a change in the heating of the Pacific Ocean. Change in that ocean temperature then leads to severe climate disruption in countries that are either in the Pacific Ocean, like the islands themselves, or around in the Pacific Basin, around the Pacific Rim, so other countries. So for example, under normal conditions, when we look at South America and on one side of the Pacific Ocean compared to Indonesia on the other side, we normally see a certain pattern of the linkage of those that climate and that weather that occurs over the Pacific Ocean. So a certain amount of water vapor is carried from the ocean itself and then drops on Indonesia. But in El Nino conditions, that water change, that change in temperature actually occurs in such a way to actually prevent that water vapor from being carried over to Indonesia, and it causes El Nino style droughts and El Nino induced droughts. And that's not only just in Indonesia, of course, but I'm giving you an example of that interplay between those two main masses of land. We see the same thing in other areas as well, including Asia and also North America. So El Nino can play into that. But once again, that's a normal climatic variation. It's an oscillation, meaning it goes ups and downs. We do see climate change disrupting that and making that pattern a little bit different over a period of time, and so we have to be concerned about climate change and its disruption, in addition to its effect overall on disrupting this normal weather that we would see that would never be expected to have such drought conditions or such severe drought conditions in many areas of the world. We also talked about deforestation, and that's actually a significant component of making drought and worsening drought, exacerbating those kinds of problems. Deforestation is the removal of a forest or stand of trees, and usually for use as farms and gardens and urban development. And of course, we want to be able to promote development, but we have to do so in a sustainable way. And when we take away the trees, we take away the ability for the land to be able to hold water, to be able to return that water back to the atmosphere as it normally occurs in transport evapotranspiration that occurs through vegetation, where that water actually comes up through the tree itself, is released through the leaves and back into the atmosphere in a more controlled way. But when we deforest these areas, when we cause this deforestation to occur by either our land clearing, the slash and burn, or other agricultural methods, we make that land more prone to the effects of drought. And then once we're into that situation, we're into a really bad spiral, because now we have to wait many, many years to be able to get that forest back in those areas. And many times that's very difficult to sustain. Agricultural methods also change the possibility or the probability and likelihood of these particular types of drought disasters. Over-farming, excessive irrigation can impact the ability of land to capture and hold the water. So, we've heard this many times, and we're in my own country, people are very concerned about this in the western United States, where large population growths in areas that are beautiful. Everyone wants to live there. It's a very temperate climate. It's very productive, and many of the fruits and vegetables that are grown in my country are grown in this particular area in the West, and particularly in California. And then once again, but too many people, too much irrigation, pulling from this, it overutilizes the water resources, and then we get in a situation where we cannot replace that back. Especially when we're talking about if the normal pattern of rainfall then diminishes at this time when we're excessively utilizing irrigation and water for agricultural needs. These agricultural practices can then exacerbate what is already there, already occurring because of this lowered rainfall. So these two things working together both worsen the effects of drought. Drought and its effects are rather remarkable when we talk about the desertification of areas, for example, in the dust storms in China. One of the things that's happened outside the capital of China in Beijing is the Gobi Desert, actually there. Many of you have probably heard of this famous area, of course. And as desertification and deforestation has occurred there, basically agricultural practices and also tree cutting for fuel and other resources for using lumber and so on, and it has caused actually the desert to expand and to stretch as these trees are cut down. The desert is expanding closer and closer to the capital of China. So that's an example of how we can actually increase the size of deserts by our own practices, our own human factors that contribute to this. And these drought effects also then in other areas of the world, luckily not so in China at this time, but in other areas of the world, in particular sub-Saharan Africa has this very frequent cause of famine associated with drought when they get into a drought and famine cycle. And it's very odd as well that actually this part of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, is also in a drought flood cycle. So they go through years of drought and then years of floods. And then we have this sort of double whammy, one disaster and then the other. But the issue with famine is that, associated with these droughts, is that long-term food security then becomes an issue. And also as well when we're talking about economic development. So we have both the factors that contribute to these types of disasters so commonly: socioeconomic status, as well as the lack of resources and agricultural food security. Both of those together really very commonly associated with these disasters of many different types, but particularly the idea of famine and drought, and it's a close association. There are factors that contribute to water shortages in particular, and we can recognize this even in absence of drought, but of course these are exacerbated when we're talking about drought disasters. So one of the things that occurs, of course, is in lower rainfall, the drying up of surface water will occur. Now the other thing that we can do actually to worsen this effect is actually by damming up rivers and creating the surface area of that same amount of water. When it normally flows in a river, it may have actually less surface area exposed to the atmosphere because it's in a river situation with a deeper flow. But when we dam these things up and make lakes, especially if we make shallow lakes that have a broad variety of surface area, a broad expanse of surface area, then we have this issue of more evaporation that come off of these lakes. So we can actually contribute to the water shortage by the very way we handle the water that we have right now. In addition, low yields of wells and springs and the wasting of water that people may misuse or underutilize the water in an effective way. Increasing demand on water when there are large numbers of populations that are growing in a certain region where water may be at a premium. And also increased food production. We all want to be able to make more food, but utilizing the water to be able to do so and create that agricultural production then also draws upon water that can be used for a wide variety of sources. So you can see there it's a multifactorial approach when we're looking at this issue of water shortage and drought conditions. Once again, not all atmospheric, not all climatic, but also has these human and other contributing natural factors. There are other factors that contribute to water shortages, including water pollution. If we can't keep the water that we have, the existing resources clean, effective, and still potable, then we lose what we already have. In addition, difficult access to water sources as well. So whether that's a border dispute where waters may be in contention between different nations or different states or regions of the world, we also have technological access to water that may be worsened over time due to maintenance issues and so on. We also have bad water distribution systems that waste a lot of water. So for example, in many areas, the local society may not have enough resources to be able to maintain the water distribution system effectively. So therefore, the pipes and the distribution systems that are established through either cities or other full regions, those become leaky. They leak out the good water, and we pump more and more water through those areas. In some cases, 40, 50, 60% of the water may be lost due to this poor and leaky distribution system. Also, if we have poor water conservation policies and practices as well, where we take for granted that we'll always have an endless supply of water and we waste it, and we use it needlessly in ways where we really need to be conserving it in a better manner, whether that be through agricultural practices, through industrial practices, or simply through our day-to-day use of water, water conservation is a key issue and can contribute to the water shortages if we don't do that effectively. There are threats to health of not enough water safety for drinking, and many people think about droughts as being, that's the number one thing as well, is that people die in a drought because they just don't have enough water to drink. But that's not always the case. Actually, what we end up finding in these drought type of situation is the first thing, and many times the main health threat comes from actually the fact that we just don't have enough safe water, that whatever water is existing is either contaminated through bacteria or chemicals and so on, and there's not enough safe water for drinking and cooking, but also, very importantly, not enough water for washing and for bathing and for normal hygiene that keep us healthy. We take for granted, our mom always says, be sure and wash your hands, so you don't get sick. And we kind of take that for granted in my country and where I grew up as a young boy. My mom always encouraged me to do that. But there is so much involved with actually keeping healthy by keeping clean, by not passing bacterial or viral or other types of chemical exposures to each other by our hand washing techniques or our sanitation techniques. So when we lose water and water starts to become at a premium, when water is not enough for everyone, we're really trying to conserve it. Many of the things that actually go first are these normal sanitation and hygiene, water for sewage treatment and water for hygiene and so on for cleaning. We really then start seeing these respiratory illnesses and diarrheal illnesses among these populations increase, even though there may be enough water for drinking, there's not enough water for washing and for bathing. There are also threats to agriculture and the economy when we lose water. So we lose this lack of water affects our animals and our crops. It also has less, as a result of those less agricultural products, we have less economic growth, and therefore there's now less money to go to the government for taxes, and which then translate into other public health activities. In addition, many of us don't think about it as well, but when you lose water in a reservoir that normally creates hydroelectricity, hydroelectric generation of electricity, we use those waters to be able to turn turbines to make electricity that then also contributes to the economic growth of society. And we lose that as well. So you see outages and brownouts and blackouts in certain areas where there's temporary loss of this because of the fact that we can no longer adequately generate electricity because of our water losses. And I've seen this for many, many years, many areas around the world, Africa, North America, and so on. So we have to think in terms of a more holistic approach when we're looking at these water issues as they relate to threats to the agriculture and to the economy. There are also environmental threats that occur as a result of these drought situations. And one of the secondary disasters that we see as a result of drought disasters are wildfires. And these are very, very common when the normal vegetation becomes so dry, the undergrowth as well also dries out, and then a little bit of natural lightning strikes and so on, or human causes of campfires or other uncontrolled burning then result in wildfires. We have the desertification that I mentioned earlier, where we actually increase the size of the desert during these drought periods because we overutilize those resources, those vegetative and agricultural resources that are on the edge of the desert and causing the desert to grow. In addition, chemical exposures either through improper water treatment or polluted water, where we've used that for industrial or chemical means, and we have those chemical exposures and lose those existing resources. So environmental threats also play a key role in the worsening or the lessening of droughts. The major causes of death, as I mentioned, during drought, we normally see malnutrition as the #1 cause of death in droughts worldwide. And most of the time, we see this in certain areas of the world that have food insecurity issues, also exacerbated by other social issues, which also may be complicated by, for example, conflict and other type of social and economic issues that are well localized. So we see this drought famine cycle, as I spoke of before, that we see in the Horn of Africa, and now there's a famine early warning system that takes into consideration the drought conditions that are in that part of the world, and then tries to predict what may be future famines or future malnutrition issues related to the droughts that are occurring today. As I mentioned also, drought not only contributes to the lack of water, but also the lack of sanitation and lack of proper hygiene when we're looking at the holding back the brunt of infectious disease outbreaks and so on. So drought definitely is associated with infectious diseases, one of those few natural disasters that are. So we have to think in terms of both of those more holistically when we're looking at drought situation, not just malnutrition, not just absolute lack of water. So with respect to the public health consequences of droughts, we also see, for example, the number of deaths that are related to drought. These differ according to high resource and low resource nations. In low resource nations, we can appreciate the fact that droughts can cause many, many deaths, as I mentioned to you, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa or the Horn of Africa in particular. Chronic illnesses can also worsen as well during this period of time with the dust and also the changes in climate associated and the changes in vegetation that are associated with drought condition. Also, food scarcity is one of the rare natural disasters that actually do cause widespread food insecurity, and especially when we're talking about low resource nations. Also, loss of routine hygiene, as well as loss of clean water, of course, all interrelated when we're talking about the drought phenomenon. So it's a more complex configuration of problems rather than just that simple absolute lack of drinking water. Now I want to compare the health impacts of drought to other natural disasters, because some of these things you may find surprising actually. Once again, we're looking at that period from 1964 to 2013, so a 50-year period, and we really saw a high impact during that period of time from drought disasters, second highest mean number of deaths per event. So droughts are large events, and those large events occur, and when they do occur, they cause a large number of deaths. So second highest average number of deaths per event were associated with drought during that 50-year period. On the other hand, it's a relatively low mortality rate when we're talking about the per 100,000 people. So it's kind of a counterintuitive, isn't it? Per 100,000 people, actually low mortality rate. So among that group, small amount, but the fact is that actually the number of people affected by drought is very large. Therefore, we see this high impact, the high mean number of deaths per event, because just so many people are affected, even though that mortality rate is actually relatively low. We also see very little displacement in comparison to drought when we're looking at other types of natural disasters. So even though tsunamis and other geological disasters like earthquakes and landslides, very high displacement rates, droughts actually very low displacement rates because people aren't displaced. Now there is, of course, displacement associated with drought, but when we compare that to other natural disasters, we don't normally see those highest rates that we would see with other types of geological emergencies. So I want to share with you that top 10 natural disasters ranked by number of lives lost worldwide over the past 50 years, because it's actually very remarkable when we're looking at drought compared to these other types of natural disasters. Drought actually takes 4 places in the top 10 when we're looking at these number of lives lost worldwide. Number 1, 1.5 million estimated fatalities in India during the 1960s due to this large-scale drought. Again, as well, in Ethiopia and Sudan, we're talking about that Horn of Africa that has frequent problems as well. Nearly 500,000, nearly 500,000 people affected by drought, actually not affected, estimated fatalities even much more affected by the drought itself. And then also in Mozambique and once again Ethiopia, again very severe drought conditions. So these are very large scale events that turn out to have high numbers of fatalities. the world's 10 deadliest drought disasters. You can see a very big pattern here when we're looking at the Horn of Africa. Somalia are 2 of those top 10, Ethiopia 2 of those top 10, Sudan, Chad also as well. Others that we see as well in there are India and also China as well. Once again, this idea of drought disaster is very, very significant when we're looking at the number of deaths. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1960s, in the 64 to 67 range, 1.5 million deaths in India. Ethiopia, as I mentioned before, also large numbers of deaths as well. These are recurrent in many areas of the world when we're looking at the instability, the lack of resources to be able to maintain adequate hydration or other alternative methods during the drought seasons. People are so intimately linked with the drought and rainfall patterns, agricultural and as well as livelihoods, as well as their very lives themselves, very much linked to a close relationship with the water flow. And so therefore we see these drought disasters on a very large scale, all too common in the same areas of the world. Secondary disasters caused by drought disasters in particular, usually associated with exacerbation of the drought disaster or disasters themselves. So for example, we talked about the drought disaster that then causes the power outage because there's no generation of hydroelectric options, no electricity being generated by hydroelectric dams and utilization of these water resources. We then see power outages, which can then contribute to other problems as well throughout society. We also see wildfires and flash floods, actually. Wait a minute, you say, Dr. Kime, flash floods and droughts? How does that match together? Well, what ends up happening, of course, is in a drought situation, the ground bakes. And so it becomes relatively impermeable on the surface of the ground itself. Then when you do get a rain, instead of getting this, this normally controlled absorption of water in that area and vegetation that actually hold that water and keep it from running off, in a situation in drought, we may see a relatively impermeable surface and the water runs off of it very much quicker. If there's a little bit of incline or ravine, now you're talking about flash flood situations. And actually we've seen this, for example, in cities, not necessarily in drought situations, but for example in Saudi Arabia where normally dry. But in drought situations, other areas of the country or other areas of the world can actually have these flash flood phenomenon. And we see this in the western United States, in my own country as well. We also see famine that results and is complicated by complex emergencies. So what do I mean by complex emergency? Usually complex emergency is a mixture of social and political as well as these agricultural and climatic issues. So it's a complex in that sense because it involves conflict. It involves drought. It involves agriculture and loss of agriculture that's affected by this lack of rainfall, or also complicated by the fact of these political insurrections or the political complications from conflict. So people can't plant because of the war going on, and they can't plant because of the drought going on, and therefore famine and complex emergencies tend to go together when we're talking about drought disasters. Now, there are measures that increase the health impact of drought disasters, and one of them, as I mentioned before, inefficient public water collection and distribution systems, so we waste what we have. In addition, of course, natural factors like high temperatures and high ambient temperatures increase the evaporation of these particular resources. And as I have mentioned in the past as well, when we have a dam that takes a river that has a relatively low surface area of the water exposure to the atmosphere, and we dam that up and create this long flat lake, we increase the amount of surface area of water facing the atmosphere, and therefore we increase the potential for evaporation of that existing resource. So we can change the amount of evaporation that occurs simply by damming it up and trying to hold water in reservoirs. So there's also a lack of hazard monitoring and forecasting, a lack of understanding of the interrelatedness of these various factors that, especially in some areas of the world that may have less than others. And so this also contributes to the drought disaster because we can't necessarily predict and prepare for ahead of time. And so that variability in different societies, that lack of access to resources may also contribute to the drought disaster itself because we just cannot be prepared. In addition, the lack of watershed management, the appropriate management of the floodplain, the appropriate management of the watershed itself, so we collect the water and funnel it and utilize it appropriately. And then what water we have, we conserve in ways, we utilize in ways that are most, really apply the best principles of conservation as opposed to utilizing it like it's an endless resource. And of course, now many of us are getting the wake-up call for what we need to do when we're talking about water conservation and drought disasters. So there are measures that reduce the health impact of disasters, mostly associated with reducing exposures in the short term and also in the long term. So in the short term, we can actually, once again, map those drought hazards. Where would we expect it to occur most likely? Where can we actually look for it and monitor and then forecast those droughts so the populations can plan for that, prepare for that, societies can be able to do so in advance of that disaster itself. And also establishing a famine early warning system. We've said before that droughts are associated with famine in many cases. So if that's the case, then being able to predict the famine by watching the conditions of drought as well, monitoring again and forecasting, and being able to provide early warning and early assistance to populations that may become affected by the drought to the point where there's actually food insecurity. So therefore, early warning systems, key element in drought, especially when we're looking at the famine early warning system of Africa, and particularly the sub-Saharan Africa and the Horn as well. Also, risk communication, letting people know what are the factors that contribute to health impacts of droughts, being able to give them protective actions and good advice on how they can protect themselves and their families and their livelihoods, adapting practices to be able to change according to what the drought is really, what the challenges that the drought are really presenting to us. And then providing humanitarian assistance in the short term when these exposures are too great. And we provide that humanitarian assistance to get people through those times of low resources, those times of infectious disease outbreaks that may be a result of drought, or, for example, the famine that then often accompanies drought. And community outreach, reaching into those smaller villages, the outer-lying areas that may be less likely to receive aid, to be able to be recognized that they too also have a role in being able to mitigate and lessen the impacts of drought when we're talking about even on the small scale as well. Even small practices at the local level can really make a difference in their ability to be able to sustain through this drought. There are also long-term risk reduction measures by reducing the exposure that we can think in terms of sustainable development. When we build large cities in areas that we know are prone to drought, whenever we have long-term drought challenges and build as though there is a tomorrow in these areas, that there may actually be a dwindling resource and a large amount of development occurring in that area. So we have to think carefully about sustainable development, being able to put in the kinds of adaptation of agricultural practices, the adaptation of water distribution mechanisms, the means and the ways that we collect water and distribute it all come into effect when we talk about sustainability. And you know, I've said this before, the sustainability is actually not thinking in terms of your own effect or your own impact, but what are you handing off to future generations? How are we transferring this risk to maybe our children or our children's children? So when we build something today, we create development, but is it sustainable, or are we passing risk? Or are we passing future drought disasters on with this particular challenge? So once again, as a final element of this as well, water conservation and resource management, very key for reducing the long-term exposures of drought. So by reducing vulnerability, we also create a healthier population. Healthy people live through droughts. Healthy people are resilient to this drought disaster. And so therefore we want to promote health, lessen health disparity. We want to lessen the dependence upon daily medications and improving mental health, because the droughts are stressful. They do put a health burden, a mental health burden on our society as we try to struggle to be able to accommodate and adapt to these types of changing conditions. Community communication as well as public knowledge and awareness all play into reducing our vulnerability, making healthier people, healthier choices when we're talking about drought situations. We want to build capacity to be resilient, safe, healthy, resilient people with access to resources that are economic, education, healthcare, food security, as well as water and sanitation and transportation. All of these resources, the availability of these resources to the population really minimize the impact of droughts, and therefore, in order to be resilient, we really need to build capacity in these areas that are higher risk. So this building capacity extends not only from healthy people, but also from healthy buildings and healthy communities. You know, healthy buildings use less water. We waste less water. We conserve more water. We really apply these structural and non-structural mitigation measures for power loss as well when we look at the issues of the linkage between electricity and also droughts as well. and also healthy communities that protect water resources and conserve the water and use it appropriately so that we can maintain through these drought disasters and hopefully get to the other side for a resilient community.